Buried for thousands of years beneath the limestone of Jerusalem, an underground door has finally been opened. Ground-penetrating radar led archaeologists to what was believed to be the tomb of King Solomon, and the world expected to find royal remains and legendary treasure. But beneath the earth there was no coffin, no trace of burial, no sign of a tomb at all. Instead, they entered a strange structure built according to mathematical proportions so precise they seemed almost impossible. A place where the natural laws of decay appeared to have been suspended. What was this place really used for? Let us pull back the veil of this mystery and uncover what the ancients tried to hide beneath the stone. Impossible wisdom. Before entering the structure found at Silwan, we must first understand the figure at the center of this mystery. Solomon. Solomon was the son of King David. He ascended the throne in Jerusalem around 970 BC and ruled the United Kingdom of Israel for about 40 years. His age is often remembered as the kingdom's most brilliant era, not because of war, but because of wealth, trade, and monumental construction. What set Solomon apart from many ancient kings was that he was not mainly described as a warrior. Ancient texts do not emphasize him leading armies into conquest. Instead, he appears as a man of extraordinary intelligence, someone who could observe nature, understand plants, animals, the stars, and resolve disputes through logic. The story of the two mothers fighting over one child is the clearest example. When Solomon proposed cutting the baby in two, he never truly intended to do it. He created a test to observe their reactions. The real mother would rather lose her child than watch that child die. Through that, the truth revealed itself. Solomon's reputation also reached far beyond Hebrew tradition. The story of the Queen of Sheba coming to test his wisdom appears in the Bible, in Islamic tradition, and in Ethiopian culture. This shows that Solomon's image spread across many ancient civilizations. But the most important point is that Solomon is credited with building the first temple in Jerusalem. In the first book of Kings, there is a very strange detail. When the temple was being built, no sound of hammer, chisel, or iron tool was heard at the construction site. In other words, the stones had already been cut somewhere else before being brought to Jerusalem and assembled. To make that possible, every measurement and every point of contact had to be calculated precisely in advance. This is not merely a religious detail. It reads like a technical description. Solomon's wealth reflected the same kind of thinking. Long distance trade, copper resources at Timnah, and trade routes reaching toward Tarsus and Ur. His kingdom operated more through organization than through war. But after Solomon died, everything quickly collapsed. The kingdom split in two. That method of construction was no longer mentioned, and the place where he was buried disappeared from the record. A system of knowledge that vast could hardly have vanished completely if it no longer remained above ground. Perhaps its traces had been hidden somewhere else. And to find that place, people would have to approach the mystery in an entirely different way. The first person to do that after 3,000 years of repeated failure was Dr. Emily Carter, an archaeologist who had spent most of her career studying ancient administrative texts rather than searching for treasure, the blueprint beneath the earth. Dr. Emily Carter did not begin this search with the goal of decoding a legend. She began with numbers, and those numbers led her to an anomaly no one else was willing to notice. In the Jerusalem archives, Carter identified a series of ancient Hebrew tax records dated to the final period of Solomon's reign. They recorded labor costs and materials being sent to an unnamed location. This site was encoded with a repeated symbol that did not match any known place name in the region. What caught Carter's attention was not the symbol itself, but the scale of the resources poured into it. The number of stone cutters, the amount of cedar wood, the volume of copper, and the quantity of olive oil recorded were all comparable to a temple-level construction project lasting many years. A project of that scale could not simply disappear from the map. Carter and her team compared the figures with the present-day terrain of Jerusalem, and a pattern began to emerge. Most of the resources had been transported to a narrow area on the slope of Silwan, just south of the city of David, where no surface structure matched the scale of that investment. There were only two possible explanations. Either the entire structure had been destroyed without leaving a trace, which was extremely unlikely for something so large, or it lay beneath the ground. In the fourth month of the project, the archaeological team brought in ground-penetrating radar, a technology that sends low-frequency radio waves into the earth and measures the returning signals. In archaeology, this tool often produces blurred images with unclear outlines of natural caves or ancient foundations. But the results at Silwan were different. The radar screen revealed a network of tunnels with precise 90 degrees angles arranged in a clear coordinate grid with the spacing between the tunnels following a consistent ratio. This was not the trace of natural erosion, nor was it the mark of caves randomly dug across different periods. Jerusalem limestone is difficult to cut, prone to fracture, and resistant to ordinary tools. intervals. Yet, the radar signals showed surfaces so flat they seemed almost free of error. One member of the team, a geophysics specialist from Tel Aviv University, described the returning signals with a sentence that left everyone silent. It did not look like geology. It looked like a blueprint. The reflected pulses returned in a steady rhythm, suggesting that beneath the surface lay a series of objects arranged at fixed intervals, not random blocks of stone. It felt like looking at the fingerprint of something intentional, created by a hand that knew exactly what it was doing. As the team pushed deeper into the analysis, they discovered that the tunnels contained false turns, dead ends, and looping passages deliberately carved to mislead intruders. This layout did not follow normal military defensive logic where people build thick walls and fortified gates. Instead, it followed the logic of a puzzle. Only those who understood the design could find the correct path. Everyone else would be swallowed by the network of loops. By this point, the ground at Silwan was no longer an ordinary archaeological site. It was a calculated structure, and the very method used to conceal it was the first layer of an encoded system, the code of the builders. Reaching the deepest entrance was not a simple matter of breaking stone. The slab sealing the tomb was a single block of limestone weighing several tons with no gap where a lever could be inserted. When the archaeological team used a three-dimensional laser scanner to survey the entire surface, they discovered that the slab did not stand alone. It was part of a complex counterweight system in which the stones behind it were held in balance by the weight of the slab in front. If force was applied incorrectly, the entire mechanism would collapse and the tunnel behind it would be buried forever. This was an important detail. In royal tombs from the same period in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia, stone block ceiling entrances were usually designed in a simple way, meant to stop thieves through physical weight alone. Their builders assumed that intruders would be treasure hunters, and the defense was to make entry physically difficult. The slab at Silwan was different. It was not designed to resist strength. It was designed to resist ignorance. Around the entrance, archaeologists found 7 rows of ancient Hebrew symbols carved with uniform depth and astonishing precision. At first, the research team assumed these were curses or prayers, something commonly found at the entrances of ancient tombs. But when a specialist in ancient Hebrew from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem was brought in to analyze them, he discovered something else. The lines did not tell a story. They recorded numbers. More specifically, they were measurements. Each row corresponded to one part of the first temple as described in the Book of Kings. From the length of the sanctuary to the height of the pillars Jachin and Boaz to the proportions between the innermost chambers, there were 7 rows matching the 7 years it took to build the temple. And each row contained a sequence of numbers that, when the archaeological team converted them into modern units, matched the biblical descriptions with accuracy down to the centimeter. But that was only the first layer. When the sequences were placed side by side, the researchers realized they formed a kind of code. The sequence for opening the slab was not a mechanical operation, but a mathematical problem. Specific points on the surface of the stone had to be pressed in the exact order encoded within the numbers. This was not a traditional lock. It was a test, and that test assumed that anyone who reached this place would know the temple, understand its proportions, and be able to read the relationship between text and physical structure. For 3 days, Carter's team worked without pause, comparing the numbers, testing sequences, and checking every step again through simulation models. On the 3rd day, when the final sequence was applied, the stone slab did not release with a loud sound. It slid to one side with a low, drawn-out rumble. The sound of stone grinding against stone across surfaces worked so precisely. They were almost perfectly flat. No dust burst out. No compressed air escaped. There was only a dark space behind it and a dense silence stretching down into the tunnel. For some members of the team, this was the most unsettling moment of the entire project. They were used to ancient tombs resisting intrusion with traps, collapsing stone, and destructive mechanisms. But this structure did not try to harm them. It simply tested whether they were worthy to enter. And that feeling, the sense of being judged by an intelligence that had died 3,000 years earlier, was something difficult to name. Samples of the world. When the flashlights swept into the first chamber behind the slab, the first thing Carter recorded in her field notebook was a list of what was not there. There was no coffin, no human remains, no small figurines representing deities meant to accompany the soul of the dead, objects normally found in Levantine tombs of the same period. There was no rary altar, no embalming oil, no wreaths or fossilized burial cloth on the floor. By every standard offerary archaeology, this was not a tomb, and yet the chamber was not empty. Along the walls stood a systematic display of materials, arranged with such clear logic that it resembled a museum more than a burial place. Gold was present, but not in the form of ingots or jewelry piled up at random. The gold had been made into instruments. There were measuring rods engraved with evenly spaced marks according to a consistent unit that the researchers later identified as the ancient Hebrew cubit. There were small containers, each carved with a different classification symbol. When chemists analyzed the residue left inside, inside, they found traces of various minerals from sulfur to copper salts arranged in a specific order. Precious aromatics were also present, and this came as a surprise. Frankincense, myrrh, saffron, and other essential oils had been stored in special clay vessels, not ordinary jars. When opened under controlled conditions, the vessels still held internal pressure and the aromatics still released a strong scent. For conservation specialists, this was almost impossible to believe. After 3,000 years, the organic compounds should have completely broken down. Their preservation showed that the clay vessels had been made by a method capable of sealing out air to an extremely high degree, a form of packaging never before recorded in archaeology from the same period at such a refined scale. At the center of the chamber stood a 7-branched lampstand, the menorah. Its shape and dimensions matched the description in the Book of Exodus of the object that once stood in the sanctuary of the first temple. But one detail made this lampstand different from every known reconstruction. Its branches were not cast in perfect symmetry. Instead, each branch leaned at a different angle. When the research team mapped these angles, they realized they matched the positions of the 7 celestial bodies visible to the naked eye in the sky above Jerusalem at a specific time of year. It is impossible to say with certainty that this was intentional, but the chance of coincidence was extremely low. Around the lampstand, other objects had been arranged in an order no one initially understood. Pieces of silk, still preserving their original dye, were placed to the east. Panels of ivory carved with patterns that were not Hebrew were placed to the south. Precious stones, lapis lazuli and malachite were placed to the north. Glazed ceramic vessels were placed to the west. When an anthropologist on the team compared the geographic origins of each object with the direction in which it had been placed, a pattern emerged. The objects had been arranged according to the direction of the places they came from. Silk from the east was placed in the east. Ivory from Africa was placed in the south. Precious stones from the region of modern Afghanistan were placed in the north toward Persia. Bright glazed ceramics from the west were placed in the west. This was not how grave goods were arranged. This was how a reference collection was arranged. The entire known world of the 10th century BC had been compressed into a single chamber with each object serving as a representative sample of its region. And at the center, the lampstand stood like an instrument of orientation. Carter paused for several minutes, standing in the middle of the chamber, her flashlight moving slowly from one object to another. She said nothing. The team remained silent as well. None of them had been trained to interpret a space like this because no comparable space had ever been described in archaeological literature. This was the point where the original assumptions began to crack and a new question emerged. If this was not a place built to bury a human being, then what had it been built for? The language of the universe on limestone. The answer, or at least part of it, was not found in the objects inside the chamber. It was on the walls behind them. As the archaeological team moved the objects for photography and mapping, their flashlights swept across the limestone walls and revealed something no one in the group could immediately process. These were not plain walls. They were covered from top to bottom with carved lines. And on closer inspection, those lines were not pictures, not writing, not scenes from the life of a king. They were diagrams. One section of wall contained a series of nested circles with inscribed and circumscribed lines drawn so precisely that the mathematicians on the team needed days to understand them. When compared with ancient mathematical texts, the researchers realized that the drawings described the relationship between regular polygons and circles, a subject Greek mathematicians are believed to have developed at least 600 years later. A mathematician from the University of Oxford, invited to examine the carvings, described them cautiously. They do not prove anything about Solomon as an individual, but they do show that whoever carved them understood geometric concepts that should not have appeared in this region at this time. Another section of the wall contained sequences of numbers. When the research team decoded them, they recognized a pattern. Each number was the sum of the two numbers before it. This is the basic form of the sequence modern mathematics calls the Fibonacci sequence, and it appears naturally in the structure of plants, shells, and other processes of natural growth. It should be noted that the same mathematical pattern can emerge independently in different cultures across different periods, and that remains the safest explanation. Even so, its presence here, carved alongside other geometric diagrams, raises an unavoidable question. Why were these numbers stored here inside a structure that everyone still called a tomb? The Seal of Solomon, familiar from legends surrounding the king, also appeared on the walls, but it was not presented as a single symbol. Instead, it was drawn at multiple scales with smaller versions nested inside larger ones according to a self-repeating rule. To modern mathematicians, this was a familiar type of pattern, a structure in which the smaller parts reflect the form of the whole. It must be emphasized that naming it this way is a modern reading, not a claim about the intention of the original carver. But the pattern itself is real, and it is repeated often enough across the walls to rule out random coincidence. The clay tablets neatly arranged in a wall niche revealed even more. more. Some recorded the measurements of the temple almost word for word, matching the description in the Book of Kings. But others contained material the archaeological team could not match with any biblical text. Some tablets recorded the movements of celestial bodies through the months according to what seemed to be an independently developed system. Others recorded formulas for calculating the area of irregular shapes, a complex problem even in later mathematics. Still others recorded the relationship between volume and mass for different building materials, approaching a primitive form of the concept of density. In the darkest corner of the chamber, resting on a low stone pedestal, stood a small chest. It had been cast from an alloy of copper and tin. When metallurgists analyzed its composition, they noticed that the purity of the metal was far higher than known bronze samples from the same period in the region. The chest had no hinges, no lock, and no lid that could be lifted away. It was a single solid mass of metal sealed with the same star-shaped mark that appeared on the entrance. This was the point where the entire team stopped. No one dared to touch the chest. Now that it was clear the structure had been designed to resist those who did not understand its logic, opening something with no visible mechanism was far too risky. Carter ordered all physical interaction with the chest to be suspended and requested that the walls be fully mapped first. When the map was complete, a clearer pattern emerged. Every carved line on the walls pointed toward a central point, and that central point was the chest itself. The diagrams were not merely diagrams. They were a kind of guide. The entire chamber had been designed to lead the viewer toward the chest, and the chest itself may have been the core of the entire structure. By then, the old assumptions about Solomon and his tomb could no longer stand. A new reading began to form, and it was not a comfortable one. The archive beneath Jerusalem. The final inscription was found on the eastern wall of the chamber, carved with exceptional precision. 5 lines of Hebrew, clean and clear, untouched by the wear of time. The linguist's translation rendered the meaning almost word for word. May wisdom guide my hand as the stars guide the sailor. When this inscription was announced, the first reaction from the academic world was an unusually long silence. Under the traditional reading, it was a personal prayer from a king placed at the end of a tomb as a final mark. But in the context of what had been found inside, some researchers began to ask whether that reading still made sense. A group of historians of mathematics led by specialists from Tel Aviv University and the University of Oxford proposed a hypothesis. It must be stressed that this is a hypothesis, not a conclusion widely accepted by the field, and it remains under debate. The hypothesis suggests that the structure at Silwan may never have been designed as a tomb in the ordinary sense. Instead, it may have been a kind of archive, a space created to preserve the core principles of measurement and calculation of a civilization in case that civilization collapsed. Their argument rests on a grounded observation. In the 10th century BC, the Eastern Mediterranean had recently passed through a prolonged wave of collapse. The Hittite Empire disappeared from Anatolia around 1180 BC. The Mycenaean civilization in Greece fell apart during the same period. Linear B, the writing system used by the Mycenaeans, was completely forgotten and had to wait until the 20th century to be deciphered again. Egypt, though still standing, had entered a long period of decline. Anyone living in the Levant during Solomon's reign could have seen that the most powerful civilizations around them were falling silent one after another. According to this hypothesis, someone, perhaps Solomon, perhaps a scholar in his court, perhaps a group of craftsmen and priests, may have recognized the pattern, and they chose not to accept the risk. Instead of passing knowledge down only through generations, a method that had failed many times in the past, they encoded the most important principles into the most durable materials their age could produce: precisely cut limestone and carefully fired clay. They placed them in an underground structure protected by mathematical problems that only people who had reached a certain level of knowledge could solve. They decorated the entrance with numbers that matched the public description of the temple, so that anyone who reached it would already have read the texts and understood the connection. And at the center they placed a sealed chest, possibly containing the deepest core of the preserved knowledge. Critics objected immediately. They pointed out that some expressions in the inscriptions showed traces of Persian influence which only appeared in this region centuries after Solomon's reign. They argued that the mathematical proportions could be explained as coincidence, and that reading the wall diagrams through the lens of modern mathematics may be assigning intentions to ancient people that they never had. These are reasonable objections, and they must be taken seriously. Yet supporters of the archive hypothesis raise a question the critics have not answered satisfactorily. If the structure was only an ordinary tomb fabricated by a later generation and attributed to Solomon, why would the creators invest such enormous effort into carving mathematical evidence with precise proportions? A task requiring extraordinary skill, and then hide it in places where almost no one could recognize it until modern scanners mapped the walls. A forger seeking fame would display the evidence. Whoever worked at Silwan concealed it. There is one final detail that both sides must confront. On the northern wall near the closing inscription, there is a small symbol that matches nothing else else in the chamber. It does not appear in the diagrams. It does not appear on the door. It does not appear on the chest. It appears only once, carved small and deep in a place easy to overlook. When linguists compared it with ancient writing systems from the region, none contained that symbol. This was the detail that led Carter, after months of work, to write one final sentence in her preliminary report. That sentence was quoted many times in later articles because it summarized the problem better than anyone else could. She wrote that her team had come to Silwan looking for a man, and they had found something else, something much larger, and they did not yet know what to call it. The chest has still not been opened. It is now being preserved under controlled conditions, awaiting the development of a method that can open it without causing damage. Until that happens, what lies inside remains a suspended question. And perhaps in some way, that question is exactly what the designers of this structure wanted to leave behind. Not an answer, but a message that some things are worth protecting, even when the civilization that created them no longer survives to explain them.